Hey everybody, it's me, SJ. Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. We're already 3 episodes in, can you believe it? It's gone by so fast, I think. Hey, welcome to 1981. We're already 2 years into the 80s. We're moving so fast. How are we feeling? I'm feeling great, by the way, just because these genres and these ideas and these movements are happening so fast and furious. Things are moving in, things are moving out. We're certainly seeing some settling going on with a couple of these genres, but on the whole, we are moving fast, and these ideas that these artists are coming up with and evolving on are just going a mile a minute. And by the way, it's going to keep going in that direction for several more years. So we're really going to have to keep our head glued down, because we're going to be whipping this way and that way, looking at all the different ideas that people are throwing out there and continuing to wrestle with, so they can land into that highly consumable product that I think that they all want to get to. I'm really excited about 1981 in particular, just because where I think in 79 we were still getting our grounding, in 80 I think we started to detect that things were changing rapidly, and in 81 we're just hitting the gas even harder. So it's just really exciting to see how some of these ideas are forming, and some of these excellent albums are coming out that are helping put these ideas on bigger platforms. It's just so exciting. Just as a reminder, in the description for today's episode, I've put a link to my big playlist, which is every album that I decided to keep from that year, whether or not they were essential. But just remember, I'm listening to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of albums every single year, so what you're seeing in this list is still something that's been truncated down based upon what I perceive to be at least meaningful or important for the year, or a standout. But then I've also got my essential list, which is a separate playlist for each year, in this case 1981, that has just all the albums that we're talking about during today's episode that I perceive to be the most impactful or most important, or the most important of the important, right? So you can check out both of those in the episode description. They're both linked there. Okay. What are we going to talk about today? As usual, we're going to talk about music trends, what's moving in, what's moving out, what's hot right now, also my essential albums for the year and why, and also my conspicuous absences from my essential list and why. And then after that, we'll close out. Sound good? Great, let's get going. So, music trends for this year, what's moving in? We're still talking about what we called country revival last episode. I'm starting to pivot on that and call it neo-traditionalist country. I think that's actually more what it's called in the general, music sphere. So it's that sound of country that's eventually going to become hyper popular in the mid 90s, and then obviously keep going forward because it's still a thing today, even in 2024. But the early markers of that are continuing to come on like they were last year, so that's progressing. Contemporary R&B, I think that we were getting some hints about that last year, and they're progressing even further this year. There's incorporating some funk elements to it, so it's definitely on the way up. Next, Blue-Eyed Soul. I think there was a little bit of a discussion about that last year in 1980 with the Police. There's even more of that this year. It's starting to permeate other popular artists and other genres and start to merge with other genres. So it's not quite exactly there yet. I know that Blue-Eyed Soul has been around prior to the 80s. Its shape in the 80s is starting to form up and solidify in 81 for sure. Rap, it's starting to creep in there. It's probably on the very edge of what's moving in. But at this point, I think officially it's moved past being in the underground, and there's enough quality albums coming out where we can declare officially that it's starting to very slowly move in. And then finally, city pop. So I think we talked in the last couple years about, during our J-pop check-ins, how city pop as a genre, which is quintessentially the Japanese popular sound in the 80s, is starting to happen. And I perceive, again, it's kind of moving from being more underground, or only a very select few artists are starting to adopt that sound. And we'll talk about what that sound means as we move along here, as we talk a little bit more about my essential albums and the J-pop check-in. But city pop is clearly taking shape and taking that form. It's not quite at the peak yet. It's not at its peak, because that probably won't happen for another few years, but it's definitely moving in. What's on right now? New wave of heavy metal is still sitting firmly at the top. New wave synth pop, I would say, is officially declared itself the definition of new wave pop in this moment. So it's taking that synth component and obviously new wave conventions and pop music, putting it together, and this is what it is becoming going forward. I think when we all think of new wave, we do think of that synth pop idea, and so it's officially hitting an 80. And then finally, post-punk, it's still here. It's still taking shape, it's still changing form, it's still finding its exact entire definition, which is great because there's still a lot to love here about post-punk, despite the fact that it's clearly exploding in a multitude of directions and definitions, but I think that it's still grounded in this sort of overarching idea of being post-punk. And then finally, what's moving out? Traditional heavy metal is still moving out. It's hanging on for dear life. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily any albums that I'm calling out as essential this year that are like AC/DC from the prior year that are paying homage to traditional heavy metal. I think it's essentially out, but people are still using some of those ideas in order to boost up their more forward-thinking sounds. So it's not totally gone just yet. It's not buried. We're getting really close, though. And then traditional R&B, I think that there's a number of albums that came out this year, some of which are on my essential albums, that are pushing out the, I would say, 70s idea of R&B, you know, like your Barry Whites, for example, which were great in their moment, but I think that we're evolving out of that. So that's what the music trends are for 1981. So we can start moving into our essential albums for this year and why, which is exciting. First, Billy Squier, Don't Say No. This is new wave heavy metal. Perfectly. At least for the United States. It's new wave heavy metal for sure. It's extremely poppy though. It's very accessible, and it gives you that real sense that new wave heavy metal is very much on trend right now, because despite being very new wave heavy metal, is about as accessible and skillful as it gets. There's not a lot of experimentation going on here, but Billy Squier is just absolutely nailing this sound and making it highly consumable. I mean, I would say for anybody that was alive in the early 80s and mid 80s and maybe even late 80s, Billy Squier was commanding rock radio. So this to me is the clearest sign that new wave heavy metal is officially just kicking their feet up, and they are hanging out on the top of the mountain as far as being on trend right now, because this album rocks, but it's also highly consumable. It's a really excellent album. It's one of my favorites for the year, just because, again, of how easy it is to listen to, but check that one out. It's a really good one. Next, Clint Eastwood, not the actor, but the reggae artist. Clint Eastwood and General Saint. The album is called Two Bad DJs. It's this sort of dub revival, whatever we've been calling it, you know, reggae revival, dub revival, whatever it is. It's this new generation, new wave of dub and reggae. It's really excellent. There were several really great albums that came out this year that followed this dub revival trend. The reason that I decided to put this one on the essentials list is because there was also clearly early signs of rap, which anybody that knows anything about the history of rap does have strong ties back to the dance hall and toasting traditions in reggae. And so there's just a lot of that going on here, where it's not necessarily straight toasting or straight dance hall that you would see as an evolution in the house parties of the Curtis Blow New York scene, but it's more their version of it, which is, I would say, proto-rap, early rap. It's really great besides that. I mean, I think that the instrumentation is great. The dub revival piece is really excellent. So check this one out. Like I said, there's a lot of great dub revival albums that came out this year, but this is the one that had just the great early rap / toasting on it. So if you're really interested in hearing the early markers of the modern era of rap, check this one out, just because it's an excellent example of where things were at the time and what the rappers of the future were listening to in order to get that inspiration. So this is an excellent one to check out. Again, Clint Eastwood, the dub artist, and not actually the actor. I know it's a little deceptive. Next, Crass, Penis Envy. Great album name for a post-punk album, especially considering the circumstances around it. The thing about Crass is that Crass has a male lead singer, but for this album, they used 2 female artists to do the vocals for it. And so the idea that they called it Penis Envy is really, really funny, especially because, again, you don't really see a lot of female artists in the punk scene, much like we talked about Girls' School last year. There is a huge female presence, so the fact that they called it Penis Envy is super funny. And can I say penis enough? I don't know. Anyway, it is post-punk, but the thing is, it's super inventive and experimentational, but firmly planted in punk. So, you know, remember how we were talking about in 1979 how Unknown Pleasures is technically defined as post-punk? This, to me, is an even clearer example of what post-punk actually is. It's punk, it's so obviously punk music, but there's so much experimentation and there's such an innovation with what they're doing, despite the fact that it's punk, that it seems like it's a little bit more one foot planted in one side and one foot planted in the other, so that we can better express and understand what post-punk actually is. It's punk, but there's experimentation going on there. There's interesting sounds. There might be a little bit of synth going on, but on the whole, it's still punk at the end of the day. So, despite the fact that this came out in 81 and there was already more highly experimentational records that were defined as post-punk a couple years prior, giving this a listen will also give you a good history lesson on how the sound was evolving from punk to whatever came next. Because that's the thing about this year too, is that the idea of what punk music was eliciting and creating as offshoots really exploded this year. You know, talk about big bangs. Punk inspired a lot of different artists to do a lot of different things. And so whether or not you know it, in the 90s and so forth, punk was one of those, I would say, catastrophic big bangs that created so many different genres and subgenres, and we're going to keep calling them out as we see them. But being able to identify and understand clearly that punk created hundreds of genres that created hundreds of genres further, it's one of, to me, the most meaningful and influential ideas in music in an era, probably several eras, multiple generations at the very least. It's created so many different ideas that it's kind of astounding to kind of go back to the beginning of where punk was initially evolving out of its traditional roots and into this new thing. And Crass, Penis Envy, I'm going to say it again, shows you that there was a lot of experimentation going on and where it actually started. Because if you take this album and you listen to just about any of the other more traditional punk records that I've kept in 79 or 80 or even this year, you can hear that there's that evolution happening. So it's in many ways like looking at a picture of the beginning of the universe that happened maybe 1,000 years after the Big Bang. So it's, you know, it's still pretty early, but you could see how things are starting to move away from that origin point, and that's really exciting to me. Next, Daryl Hall and John Oates, Hall and Oates, Private Eyes. The album, not just the track on it, though the track is really fantastic. It's Blue-Eyed Soul. We were talking about how that was moving in. And when we say moving in, we mean this kind of version. You know, it's the Michael McDonald post Doobie Brothers era of Blue-Eyed Soul that's ushered in with Phil Collins, again with Hall & Oates, with all the offshoots that came off of these, you know, influential artists. You know, so that's all starting to happen here. At least it's starting to find its footing. Where last year I kept the Hall & Oates album in my big list for 1980, but I didn't think it was essential, and I also didn't think it was impactful enough to call it conspicuous absence. But this year, they've really, really improved since 80. They've really tightened it up. They've really started to find their sound and approach their vision in a more, you know, consumable way. And like I said, I think they're finding their sound. Additionally, my impression, just one guy's opinion, the chemistry that they have with each other, to me, is one of the best parts about this album. To me, if it weren't for the instruments being part of the music, I would just presume these guys were just sitting in their living room, just grooving and having a really good time just coming up with these songs. And then there also happens to be instruments along with it. To me, that creates a certain degree of vulnerability and intimacy with the songs that I really, really enjoy about them. And I'm really excited for where Hall & Oates and the idea of their sound continues to permeate in the 80s, because I honestly think they're not necessarily doing anything that's hyper innovative, because the idea of Blue-Eyed Soul is not an innovative idea necessarily, but their sound really gets replicated over the next decade or so and continues to evolve too. So just honoring the fact that this is a really great album. It's the beginning of something really wonderful in music, and Private Eyes is a really great song. Also, I can't go for that. Another great track for me. Anyway, next, Diamond Head, Lightning to the Nations, also known as their White Album. This is new wave of British heavy metal, for sure. It's kind of like Crass and Penis Envy, I'm going to say it again. It's showing exactly what the new wave of British heavy metal is to a T, because it strips away all of these extra sounds and extra ideas and just shows the merging of punk and metal together into this perfect harmony. It's an astounding album. It's an amazing album. If you haven't listened to it before and you like either or both of the punk or metal genres, or the idea of new wave of British heavy metal, any of that stuff, or if you just want to see something amazing happen, listen to this album. To me, at least as far as we've gone so far, this is the first time that we have an album where you can actually see the beginning of a big bang happening right now in real time. Listening to some of these tracks, and I'll call them out specifically just because of how impactful they are, The Prince and Am I Evil specifically Listening to those tracks in 1981 was to me the beginning of so much, so many ideas. The possibility that people who were later artists were listening to those tracks and thought, I could make an entire album off of those ideas is high. Very, very high. Listening to those tracks, especially some of those guitar riffs and some of the things that they're singing about, you can hear that there's the 70s influence. You can hear the traditional punk influence. You can hear the traditional metal influence, but they're taking it in different directions, vastly different directions. And they're doing it so confidently. They are declaring and showing everybody, we could take this stuff and move in a totally different way. And it was deeply inspiring. Like I said, so far in our musical journey, this is the only actual example that I could speak to where you are there for the very moment that all the material in the great nothingness explodes and turns into galaxies of inspiration right here, right now. Give this one a listen. It's one of my favorites of the whole year, not just because of how important and influential it is. It's just a really great album, period. Next, Echo and the Bunnymen, Heaven Up Here. This is the second time that Echo and the Bunnymen is on the Essential list. Good for them. Woo! Very excited for them. New wave and post-punk put together just like last time. I think that where we talked last year about how they need to clean up that last 5% to take it to the heights that they need to in order to get to their perfect moment, I think if they haven't done all 5% of it, they've gotten at least 4.5%. Like, I think that they're moving in excellent directions like we all knew that they would, right? It's no surprise. Echo and the Bunnymen, super famous. But I definitely think that they've evolved even past what they were doing last year into something really wonderful for this year. If you liked Echo and the Bunnymen last year, give this one a listen. It's even better, I would say. So let's keep it going, right? Let's keep the depression rolling. Next, the Go-Go's, Beauty and the Beat. Obviously, this is a really popular album. It's a really famous album. It's considered to be a highly, highly influential and impactful album. All of that's true, I think. And not just because I said it or because somebody told me that and I believe them. The thing about this album that's really tremendous, though, is despite the fact that it's very obviously got a pop angle to it, and it's got the 60s golden era of Motown sound to it with the harmonies and everything like that. Like, yes, they're obviously paying homage to that, which is really excellent. I mean, they even called it the Go-Go's, right? It's funny. But if you really pay attention and listen, you can detect almost immediately that this is actually new wave punk music. This isn't pop music. I mean, it is in a way, but it's punk. And the reason that I say that is, with the exception of the key that they sing in and the pace, which is slower, it's just punk all over. The conventions, the harmonies, how they play their instruments, like everything about it has this weird punk edge to it that's like wrapped in bubblegum. It's very unusual. You know, and it's even got that tinge of anxiety that comes along with new wave. But you have to really listen and pay attention, because I think that you could just listen to Our Lips Are Sealed, one of their big hits on this album, and go, yeah, okay, fine, this sounds like pop music. But if you hear some of the notes that they sing, I'm not going to sing it for you. I'm not going to put you off by giving you my vocal stylings. But if you go in and listen to the song, that one specifically, you can hear that there's punk conventions in there. You can hear that they're a little off kilter. You can hear that what they're singing about isn't exactly rainbows and sunshine, right? It's a really calculated album, and it's genius, honestly. It's kind of genius. And what I would say is that whether or not they were doing this from an irreverent perspective or they were doing it through deep amounts of irony, this to me is the future of pop punk, which, I mean, is even still popular today in 2024. They were clearly giving a roadmap to other acts that were interested in doing something that was akin to punk. Like, it wasn't just straight up saccharine bubblegum pop, but wanted to do something with a little bit of an edge to it. And as a result, they were giving that inspiration. Again, it's a little bit like a Big Bang in and of itself, not necessarily to me like Lightning to the Nations, but Beauty and the Beat is about as clear of a roadmap as you could get, or even the markings of a Big Bang, to the future of the pop punk movement, which is, again, fundamentally different than a lot of these other offshoots of punk, but it's still that inspiration nonetheless. And this is also why, as I said, there's so many different ways that people are now playing with the ideas of punk music in this new wave, which is why it's in the mix, right? It's on the mountaintop, because people are taking these ideas and just moving them around and shifting them and seeing how they can play with them in totally different ways to determine if there's a new idea here. And clearly with the Go-Go's, Beauty and the Beat, there's a new idea here and they're riding it. So good for them. Next, Lizzie Mercier de Clos, Mambo Nassau. Here's the thing. This, I think, not that I know a lot about it, I think is defined as no wave as opposed to new wave. It's definitely avant-garde. It's fabulously experimentational, I'll say that much. Lizzie does a really excellent job at whatever this is. I'm not totally even sure what it is. It's highly accessible. I don't really know a lot about her as an artist, but she's clearly got a very distinctive vision. It's excellently done. There's a lot of quality here. It's varied in terms of what it's delivering up. It definitely seems more avant-garde, for sure, but it's great nonetheless. And it's clear, too, that however we define no wave, which I think actually the definition of no wave is essentially whatever was ushering in, we talked about what new wave was an episode or two ago, that no wave is essentially even rejecting all that stuff and saying, no, I'm just going to be innovative, but I'm not going to go with where everybody else is clearly going here. There's no anxiety, there's no worry, there's no irreverence. There's just taking it in a different direction and being a little avant-garde with it. But it's all really great, highly accessible, highly consumable stuff. I would really just kind of give it a listen and see if you like it. It's not challenging, I would say. It's just, it doesn't sound like most things that we're listening to right now. So give it a listen. It's just really great to me. It's hard to define, but it doesn't take away from its quality. It's very clear quality. Now moving in the other direction, away from something that we don't really well understand or can define very well to something we can very easily define. Luther Vandross, Never Too Much. It's R&B, period. There's nothing more to say about it. Like we were talking about a few minutes ago about how contemporary R&B was moving in, traditional R&B was moving out, this is one of those markers that shows that the existing 70s idea of R&B is being taken and evolved out into something else. This is the sign. It sounds very much like 70s R&B. Even the first track, Never Too Much. It sounds like something that Barry White could have sang, except it's a little bit more punchy. There's a little bit more of a dynamic to it. Luther Vandross in this case is a little bit more lively in how he's singing the lyrics. There's a little bit of a Quiet Storm thing going on, right? So there's clearly an evolution that he's taking with this album, which is great. It's an evolution. It's not a strict, like, we're stopping this and we're changing directions. He's evolving into the next era, for sure. It's a very tight album. It's a short album, but there's a lot of quality here. To me, it's the easiest listen of the year, period. It's an excellent album, period. Love this one. Next, Oingo Boingo, which I love saying that. Oingo Boingo, Only a Lad. It's a great album. Synth pop, for sure. It is new wave synth pop, period. The great thing about this album is, to me, it takes Devo and XTC, which you may or may not have detected or seen, that they keep not being on my essential list. I think I even called out XTC in 79 as being on my conspicuous absences, because I just think they keep missing things or they keep reveling too much in their ideas that they have. Oingo Boingo, love that, takes all of that and somehow polishes everything up that has been missing and the best bits from both artists and turns it into something great and hilarious. It's funny and irreverent in all the right ways. It's like Talking Heads, but it's totally absurd. It's really, really great stuff. Like, it's clearly synth pop. They clearly have a vision, but also they take themselves seriously in no way, which is great. So I would definitely give this one a listen, just because, like I said, it takes the just hard-coded, disembodied voice idea from Devo, and it takes the sort of ridiculousness of XTC taking nothing seriously and the Talking Heads having this very clear synth vision, and, like I said, kind of putting it all together into this really fun, enjoyable, highly consumable package. It's really great. I I love this album. It's so silly. That's the thing about a lot of these albums too. There's a lot of silly albums that are starting to come out that have a very particular perspective, which I really enjoy. Next, something that is very not silly, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, Architecture and Morality. This one is new wave synth, very much so. It's also post-punk, like Unknown Pleasures is post-punk. It's pretty famous with 80s know-it-alls, I would say, this album. Anytime I ever see anybody that's wearing an Architecture and Morality t-shirt, I know that they're trying to signal to everybody that they know something about music. It's definitely a very beautiful and haunting album. That new wave anxiety is undeniably palpable in this album. Like I said, it's like Unknown Pleasures. It's just like more unhinged, I would say. But it's also got more highs and lows, I think, than that album. So clearly they're taking that idea of Unknown Pleasures, Joy Division, and they're evolving it into something that's even more melodic, if it can be. I don't know. You'll listen, you'll hear it, and you'll say, oh yeah, I can kind of hear that's a little bit more accessible than Unknown Pleasures was. A little bit, a tiny bit. I mean, when they say they're orchestral maneuvers in the dark, like, it sounds like it. It literally sounds like it. So, well-named band, for sure. This is one of my favorite albums, too. It's like, mostly just because of how unhinged it is. It's really great. Next, something that's not particularly unhinged, Phil Collins, Face Value. It's soft rock. This to me was Phil Collins' stepping out moment. He had been with Genesis for ages and ages and ages. He, I think, maybe in this year too, was the first time he was the lead singer instead of Peter Gabriel. By the way, I did not put that album in my essential albums or in my conspicuous absences. Abacab is not, it's fine, it's good, but I didn't think it was meaningful either way. I think this album is much, much better. Soft rock is not one of my favorite genres, but I acknowledge that he crushed it on this album. Track 1 to me is nearly perfect. In the Air Tonight is maybe a little long. Probably it's like 20% too long, but the ideas are really great. Talk about a haunting album. And he plays with a lot of really fun ideas. I believe in my heart of hearts that he's working towards ushering in this new idea of soft rock. Soft rock did exist for ages beforehand, but his ideas that he's trying to put forward, he's definitely announcing to the music world that these ideas that he's coming up with should be followed because there's a lot of juice to squeeze here. And I agree with him. Like I said, soft rock is not one of my favorites when it comes to genres, but I acknowledge when it's being done well, and this is done very, very well. There's a lot of good, easy listens here, for sure. And talk about, like how Billy Squier was on the radio all the time in the 80s on rock stations. Phil Collins was on the radio all the time, all the other pop stations. So, he was the other one that was just all over the place, for sure. And like I said, juxtapose the confidence and the focus here with Abacab by Genesis, which he also did the vocals on for this year. Abacab, comparatively, there's one or two good ones on there, but for the most part, he seems far more passionate in Face Value, for sure. Like he's clearly very focused. He's got a huge vision there. It almost seems like Genesis is a waning priority for him, which is unfortunate because he wasn't even the original lead singer of it. So it's all very sad. The death of Genesis is upon us, unfortunately. Next, the Psychedelic Furs, Talk, Talk, Talk. It's new wave punk. I would even call it proto-neo psychedelic rock, because neo psychedelic rock happens in the 90s, and I think that this comes a little bit before it. They've tightened things up considerably. Remember last year when I said that they just sounded like David Bowie on a sad day? They still a little bit kind of do, like maybe 10%, but they've really tightened things up here. I honor the fact that they are clearly working very hard to find their own sound, even if they're grounded off of, I would say, one of the most distinctive rock voices and sounds and perspectives over the last 100 years, right, in David Bowie. So they clearly are deeply inspired by him, but they're working so hard to get out of his orbit and make their own thing, and they're really trying to do it, and I really honor that. There's some hits on here, Pretty in Pink's on here, and they're clearly moving in that really excellent direction of their version of new wave punk, which eventually will become like emo, it's really great stuff. And there is a little bit of a psychedelic component to it, I guess, maybe a little bit. But either way, I think that they've tightened it up enough to find their way onto the essential albums for this year. Talk, Talk, Talk is a great, great album for sure. Next, Rick James, Street Songs. I love this album. It's definitely one of my favorite albums for this year. It's funk, obviously. It's contemporary R&B, obviously. And it's a little new wave. And not just because that's what he says in Super Freak, right? In new wave magazines, right? But this is just such a great, it's such a great, ridiculous, ridiculous, ridiculous album. And the thing is, despite the fact that it's ridiculous, it's also extraordinarily vulnerable, which is interesting to say about Rick James because he always comes across, at least I think in pop culture, as a highly confident, swaggering artist. And for people that may or may not remember him from Chappelle's Show and his, cocaine's a hell of a drug thing, like he's clearly a ridiculous person. But there is a high degree of vulnerability in this album where, yeah, he's talking about sex a lot. And I would say the old R&B innuendo dictionary or thesaurus that used to exist when, we weren't really talking about sex or talking about intimacy or any of this other stuff, and they would talk around it with innuendo. He just threw that whole thing out the window. He was like, this thing is useless. And he's just talking about all of it very directly out in the open with absolutely nothing obscuring it. It's really great. It's pretty raunchy. But somehow while he's doing all of that, he is working hard. He clearly cares a lot about what this is. He's putting a lot of effort into it. and he is trying some interesting and different things. And I think we need to sometimes take that step back away from some of these albums like this that are hyper famous, that there's some really super famous tracks on them. And at the top level, you can listen to this and go, man, this is silly, or it's ridiculous, or it's really in your face raunchy. And peel all that back and go, he's actually being tremendously vulnerable with this album, despite the fact that in real life, as we know, he's a very ridiculous person. Right. So I'm honoring the fact that he went into this with some really interesting ideas and he executed them very well, but they were experimentational nonetheless. It's one of the easiest albums to listen to this whole year very easily. It's, you know, it's a little on the longer side, right? It's not like 6 tracks, like Never Too Much, but it's a really great album. If you haven't listened to it in a long time, or if you've only listened to some of the tracks because some of them are hyper famous, go back and listen to the whole thing. If you listen to them all right up against each other in the specific vision that Rick James had for this album, maybe some of these vulnerability pieces can come together a little bit clearer for you. Just my recommendation. Next, Rush. Moving Pictures. I think the cover art for the album is a triple entendre, which is just a fun thing, a fun little fact. The cover art for this is, I think, a triple entendre, which is super fun. To me, I'm defining this, yeah, I mean, there's some components of it being 70s rock. Yeah, there's some components of it being 80s rock. It's obviously Rush doing Rush, but there's a lot in here that they're playing with that I would define as pre-alternative rock. The instrumentation is amazing. I mean, the guitar work is not to be debated. Like, YYZ is, I would say, a standard for, you know, most guitarists that are showing their chops or, you know, practicing getting really excellent at the guitar. There's no debate there, period. Also, like I said, they're taking some of those 70s vocal stylings and evolving them in a new direction, which, you know, much like Crass Penis Envy, I said it again, is that they have one foot planted in the past, one foot planted in the future, and they're really showing you that thread that they're pulling from what was to what will be, versus we're just going to leap out and start doing something totally new, which might be more on the side of avant-garde because we're just rejecting the past and we're doing something in the future. This is just another really great example of we've got a foot planted in the past, we've got a foot planted in the future, and we're showing you that trend line between where we were and where we're going. This is another great example of that, like I said, because this album to me spans 3 decades. It's got a 70s idea, it's got 80s ideas, it's got 90s ideas. It's really great. This one's, again, it's a really short one because Rush albums are usually really short. Give this one a listen. It's really great. There's a lot of good hits on it. So go give it a listen, please. Next, Stiff Little Fingers, go for it. Stiff Little Fingers had an album in my big list from 1980. I didn't think it warranted getting on my essential list for that year or for my conspicuous absences for that year. I was waiting for this album, to be honest. Because yes, it is new wave punk, but I also consider it to be one of, again, the clearest signs of pre-modern era punk. And I have no idea if they're doing this on purpose or by accident, like if this was some inspiration that they had, or if they were just being silly and playing around with it. I don't know enough about Stiff Little Fingers to make that judgment call. But what they've done in this album, which is genius, and again, another one of those like lightning to the nation, Big Bang moments, which I think in this case, you really can't tell if they did it on purpose or by accident, where with Lightning to the Nations, you clearly saw that they were doing things on purpose, is they started to smooth out the edges of punk, those sharp spikes of frustration and anger and emotion in punk, and really kind of like not cutting the head off, but you're really kind of smoothing them out and massaging them. So it's making this more consumable sound as a result. Like I said, I have no idea if it was an accident or they did it on purpose, but they have incidentally stumbled onto the future of popular culture punk rock music. For example, think Green Day, right? Like, they've clearly figured something out here, or they made a song about it, or they made multiple songs about it on this album, and they just inadvertently ushered in and birthed the future of punk rock music. Who knows? I don't know because I haven't done my research. But this is, again, another one of those, I wouldn't say it's like the biggest of bangs like Diamond Head, Lightning to the Nations, where it exploded just hundreds of genres off of it. I think that this created probably a longer trend line of popular punk rock music for ages and ages and ages and ages and ages, just based upon this one album. It's deeply, deeply influential. I would give it a listen, first of all, because it's really great and really enjoyable, but also just giving that listen to, yeah, they've got that original punk idea, but then interestingly enough, they're incorporating some of these sort of more chill reggae ideas into it. And that was that key, that missing thing that needed to smooth things out a little bit so that it becomes more consumable going forward. Again, I have no idea if this is actually what happened here exactly, be it on purpose or by accident, but there are so many things that you can pick out just from this album to say, oh yeah, I can kind of hear and see how later stage punk rock came to be because of things like this. So give this one a listen. It's really great and influential. Next, hey, this is the first time we've actually had a J-pop album that is not part of our J-pop check-in where we're just like looking over there and seeing what's going on. This is an honest to goodness album that is on the essential list. So good for her. So Taeko Onuki. The album is called Adventure, not Adventure, but Adventure. It's city pop. This is the first time that a J-pop record is actually on the essentials. It's pretty darn great. If nothing else, it's just an excellent example of the city pop sound coming into its own in the early 80s. Because I think, based upon my very limited understanding of history, that city pop technically started in the mid-late 70s, and we've been kind of talking about it here and there on the periphery when we're doing our J-pop check-ins. But to me, this is the best example of it really coming onto the scene and affirming itself in at least Japanese popular music. And the reason that I say this when we talk about what city pop is exactly, so first of all, I think that it's got its own very distinctive sound. It doesn't sound like Western pop music at all. It's got an ethereal quality to it, as if there's a tremendous amount of softness to the sound and easiness to it. It does a little bit sound like there could be some micro disco influences. It sounds like there could be a little bit of those micro like songstress of the 70s ideas in there too, but it's distinctly its own thing in Japan. And I would say that the Japanese really own innovating on synths for just straight ahead pop music. They do an excellent job of that. That's a tiny bit of a spoiler, but I would say consistently the Japanese producers that are producing these pop artists, especially during the city pop era of J-pop, they are really trying to figure out how do we use these synths in order to deliver higher quality by the numbers pop music to the masses. And so they're aggressively innovating on how do we use these synths for every single record you'll hear year over year. And I've listened to thousands of them at this point, believe me. And this to me is just one of those really great early examples of they're using synths in a slightly different way than, traditional synth pop is being executed in the West. You can really understand and detect that soft pop idea that's coming out in Taeko's voice. It's really great. Give this one just a track or two. And then if you're not interested in the rest of it, just move on. But this is a really excellent example of what this sounds like as we're moving along here. And like I said, it made it into the essentials. So I think it was good enough in order to stand out on its own as a really great example of this era of pop music that is ushering its way in 81. Finally, before the J-pop check-in, of which we only have one album this time, and it's a brief one, This Heat, Deceit. It's post-punk and another avant-garde album. I think this one is very, very avant-garde, where Mambo Nassau was a little bit more pop avant-garde, like it was pretty accessible. This one is like if you take the post-punk ideas of Joy Division and even more avant-garde ideas, it's still accessible, right? Like I will call out that this is a complicated album. It's far and away the hardest album to listen to on my essentials for this year and probably even my big list. But that doesn't mean it's inaccessible necessarily. And let's not forget, it's not scary, right? It's just music. We're just listening to the music and we're trying to understand it. We're being curious people and trying to figure out what they were going for. I think it's still highly, highly listenable, but there are pieces to it where you're like, wow, that's really out there. That's kind of aggressive. That's, kind of assaulting. But the beautiful thing about it is that they're trying to figure out how do we take unknown pleasures and make it go even further. Right? Because this is not synth pop like orchestral maneuvers in the dark. This is clearly still that post-punk synth idea and taking it even further. And I would just give this one a listen. Give it a track or two and just see if this is your vibe. And if not, fine. At least we can honor the fact that you gave it a shot, right? And you led with your curiosity, which is the whole point of us doing this whole thing. So just give it a listen. See what it feels like. See what comes up for you. See what it elicits. I love this album. It's one of my favorites for the year. Okay, lastly, J-pop check-in. This one's going to be really brief, like I said. The artist is called Loudness. The album is called The Birthday Eve. The reason that I put this on J-pop check-in, despite the fact that we had Taeko Onuki's Adventure on here too, as part of my essential list, is that I want you all to get a sense for J-rock, Japanese rock music. Give this one a listen, even just a track or two. The sound that's coming out of it, which sounds a little bit like goodness, like Ronnie James Dio crossed with AC/DC, crossed with Journey, crossed with a couple other different things. This sound that you're hearing coming out of the vocals and also the guitar playing, like just kind of the whole idea, Loudness is a deeply, 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 deeply influential J-rock band from the very early 80s that influenced J-rock for at least the next 7, 8, 9 years. So, like I said, just give this one maybe a track just so you can ground yourself in what it sounds like, because as we talk more about, oh yeah, this sounds like Loudness, or this is J-rock again, this is the exact sound that we're talking about. It does start to evolve further. The J-rock community sits on this one for a while, so just get yourself familiar and comfortable with it because it's going to keep coming up for sure. Okay, so that's my essential albums for this year and why. So next, before we close out, let's talk about some of my conspicuous absences. The first one's The Human League, Dare. The reason that I put this on my conspicuous absences list is because Do You Want Me is on this album. And even the album cover is, I would say, romanticized to be like quintessentially 80s new wave synth pop greatness. And Do You Want Me is an excellent song. It's one of my favorite songs from the 80s period, and I think a lot of people would agree with that, at least from a synth pop perspective. It's, so quintessential. But the thing is, the rest of the album just isn't very interesting. It's highly repetitive. There aren't really a lot of highs, and there's a couple misses on there. Honestly, if it weren't for Do You Want Me, which by the way is the last track on the album, which was a strange decision from the artist's and producer's standpoint, I would have probably just skipped right over this album. Like if it were me in 1981 looking for a new record, if I didn't know that Do You Want Me was the last track on this album, I probably would just walk right past it and not even think twice about it, even if I heard a little bit of it before I bought it. I think that a lot of artists have already come along, even in 79, that were doing a lot more interesting things and just leapt way over what Human League is doing in this case. I wish that they would push themselves a little bit further than this, and it's possible that now that they've done Do You Want Me and it finds such commercial success that they're going to try and go further with that and take it to the next level. But at least for this album, I think that they were playing with that idea in that one track, and then everything else was kind of the banality of a year ago synth pop. So because of that, they might shift and pivot, but at least for this year, for me, no. Next, unfortunately, Stevie Nicks, Belladonna. She's great. I mean, let's not get it twisted. But the thing is, there's nothing really fresh about this album, though. And I think that she's just holding on to a lot of the stuff that was popular in the mid-late 70s as far as pop was concerned. And so there's just not a lot of interesting, new, experimental, ambitious ideas in this album. Having said that, this album is very enveloping. Like, even if you're listening to it and going, yeah, okay, fine. I mean, there's nothing like groundbreaking about this. You're still totally wrapped up in her voice and her expression of the music. And that's what I think makes it so great, and also why it's a conspicuous absence. But for me, there's just not enough push in this album. But I would still give it a listen if you really like Stevie Nicks, because she's a really great artist. Like I said, she really draws you in with her voice. She does an excellent job of that. It's on my big list if you really care to listen to it. Another great example of this is my next one, Juice Newton, Juice. I'm going to give her all the props in the world. She's an excellent singer. She's an excellent artist. But again, she's pushing absolutely no boundaries with this album. It's just another fabulous voice doing kind of uninteresting work, which is a shame, especially considering that in some of the tracks, she's ushering in what I consider to be that neo-traditionalist country idea a little tiny bit, but she's still calling back to, like, Dolly Parton, those kind of ideas in the mid 70s as far as, that brand of country. So she's just not leaping out far enough, to be honest. But she's an excellent artist, and I'm sure that she's going to keep progressing and doing her thing too, because I do know that a lot of the sounds that she's putting out in this album are deeply influential to songstresses of the mid and late 90s. So it's not like she's not influential, but this one for me was just uninteresting and not ambitious in any way. So it's unfortunate because I love Juice Newton, but it is what it is. And then finally, this one is a huge heartbreak for me because I find this album to be absolutely hilarious, is The Replacement. Sorry, Ma, I forgot to take out the trash. This album is so funny. So it's punk, right? It's pretty straight ahead punk if you really think about it. I think it's deeply influential though, because it's making punk more commercially accessible, I would say. They're playing with themes in the album that are more widely understood in teenage pop culture at the time, and then generally speaking, like even a teenager listening to this in the 90s which I'm sure was happening in the late 80s, in the 2000s, even today, would hear some of this stuff and go, yeah, I can totally relate to that, which I think is a little bit of a pivot from traditional punk music, which was a little less about teenage problems and a little bit more about world problems, right? I'm sure there was teenage problems that were baked in. I probably just missed it because I started listening in 79, right? But also, this album is just, like I said, it's really, really funny, and it follows one of the most important things for me about punk music, which is that they're very brief, fast songs. You know, like all these songs are clocking in at like a minute, minute and a half, maybe almost 2 minutes in some cases, but for the most part, they're just going through a bunch of topics, being really ridiculous, singing about them, and just playing their punk rock as fast as possible. Like it's just really funny. It's really entertaining. Like I said, I mean, we're talking about, like, I'm sure it influenced Blink-182, you know, and the like, you know, it's definitely one of those highly influential albums, but compared to everything else that we did in our essential albums for this year, it's a little bit too on the nose for punk. And also, I don't believe that they've necessarily found the entirety of their voice yet, because I think they're playing around, like literally playing around and being silly a lot. And I think that as they find their voice and their certainty with their material and their approach, they'll even out a little bit more. But for right now, it's like hyper, hyper raw in a way in which you're like, I don't really know what's coming next on this album. Is it going to be good? Is it going to be great? Is it going to be terrible? Is it going to be stupid? Is it going to be silly? Like, I have no idea. And in some cases, that's a draw. But in my case, it speaks to me that they haven't yet solidified who they are or what they want to be. And so I'm waiting for them to shore up the edges and find their voice. So I'm waiting. I'm hoping. All right. So as usual, this is all just my opinion, right? This is totally subjective. If you hated everything I thought, great. If you loved everything I thought, well, that's questionable. I said some pretty controversial things. But I am curious to know what you agreed with, what you disagreed with. What did I miss? I had to have missed something, right? 1981 had so much going on. It doesn't compare to 1982, which I'm terrified to do. But I'm sure I missed something. What did you learn about this year? Did you learn anything about what's going on with post-punk or maybe city pop or something? Tell me. Let me know. And hey, don't forget to check out the Essential playlist, which is, again, linked in the description of this episode. It is just a playlist on Spotify for all of these albums that I've laid out here on my Essentials. My big list, which is everything I kept from 1981, to include my conspicuous absences and everything else that I left off my list here today, but I still liked. Also linked in the description of the episode. Please join us again if you want to keep going on this crazy journey, because I'm having a lot of fun. Hopefully you're having a lot of fun too. We got a lot of ground to cover. Don't forget to rate us on Spotify or wherever you're listening to us. And please, please, please make sure that you're commenting. Find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Send us your thoughts. Send us your hate DMs, whatever you want to do. I'm excited about all of it. Make sure to subscribe if you're really excited about finding out when the latest episodes come out. We're putting them out every Tuesday at this point because I'm excited to do them, and why not, right? Make sure to tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your political opponents. I have no idea. Do whatever you want to do, because at the end of the day, look, we're going through a lot of interesting music moments here, and I know that can be some really challenging stuff that we're listening to here, to include stuff from other countries that maybe you don't know the language. But don't forget that despite all of this stuff, right, none of this stuff is scary. It's just music, right? Thanks for listening.